EHS is a puzzling condition. It is characterized by the attribution of non-specific symptoms to EMF exposure associated with coping strategies resting on the management of such exposure.
Yes,
These strategies include getting rid of personal electronic devices, avoiding highly exposed places like shopping centers or public transport, wearing EMF shielding clothes, sleeping on a protective canopy, or taking shelter in isolated woods or caves. These symptoms and strategies deeply alter the lives of EHS people. However, the electromagnetic nature of EHS has proven impossible to corroborate. Many experimental studies have failed to establish a link between EHS people's perceptions or bodily reactions and EMF exposure in double-blind conditions. These studies suffer from significant drawbacks, which will be discussed in the next presentation. For instance, they focus on a limited range of exposure types, only deal with short-term and acute effects, and are often statistically underpowered. Nonetheless, their results are coherent with those of environmental studies conducted in real-world settings. These studies have found no meaningful correlation between estimated or measured EMF exposure in daily life and non-specific physical symptoms, whether or not attributed to EMF, and even with EHS complaints. Additionally, the electromagnetic nature of EHS is also implausible, as no biophysical mechanism has been demonstrated that could explain EHS symptoms. Despite decades of research on EMF health effects, only two biological effects of EMF exposure have been consistently identified: electromagnetic induction for low-frequency EMF and dielectric heating for radiofrequency EMF. But their health effects are qualitatively different from the symptoms experienced by EHS people, like sleep disorders, headaches, or cognitive disorders. Furthermore, the levels of exposure required for such effects to appear are much higher than those actually observed in daily environments. The only notable exception regards the alteration of sleep electroencephalography under RF EMF exposure, which has been consistently observed in recent years, but is not associated with any effect on sleep macrostructure or perceived sleep quality, and was not found to be higher among EHS persons than healthy controls. This begs the question of how EHS people can be convinced of being sensitive to EMF when available scientific evidence overwhelmingly points to the contrary. That question has already been addressed at the individual level through the description of the attribution processes leading EHS people to self-diagnose as such. In this presentation, I will tackle that question at the collective level by studying how EHS spread in France and eventually become a social issue. I will draw conclusions regarding the care of EHS people and the future of EHS research. Data is drawn from approximately 80 interviews with various stakeholders: EHS people, representatives of EHS support groups, activists against cell size and so-called electromagnetic pollution, biophysicists, physicians. Data also includes a large set of documents like scientific papers, expert and media reports, movies, websites, mailing lists and books dealing with EHS or EMF health effects. This dataset was analyzed with a chronological and macro-social approach aimed at retracing the process through which EHS was socially constructed as an emerging environmental condition and as a social issue in France in the last 25 years. It quickly appeared that EHS did not spread in a neutral socio-political context. It started to get attention in the course of a violent controversy around cell site and so-called electromagnetic pollution. I will present that controversy first, before showing how it gave rise to a second and partially distinct controversy around EHS. In the US, several controversies erupted around microwave ovens and power lines in the 1970s, video display terminals in the 1980s, and cell phones in the early 1990s. There is no indication that these controversies ever spread to France, where the first dispute about EMF emitting devices broke out in the late 1990s and developed in 4 stages. Mobile telephony was launched in 1992 and quickly met with commercial success, resulting in the proliferation of cell sites. 18,000 were sitting between 1997 and 2001, usually on rooftops or balconies in urban areas and on dedicated masts in peri-urban and rural areas. Some were visually detrimental and provoked first reaction from their neighbors in 1998, putting forward aesthetic or environmental arguments while also denouncing the apparent lack of regulation. Indeed, existing regulations were mostly aimed at ensuring electromagnetic compatibility and enforcing exposure safety levels defined in relation to EMF thermal effects. Decisions regarding the localization of cell sites were left entirely up to mobile network operators and their subcontractors, who negotiated privately with landlords, considering only technical and financial constraints. Consequently, residents often learned about cell sites to be installed in the neighborhood when construction work began, which promoted a climate of anger and suspicion. Some people literally woke up one morning to find a crane erecting a 50-meter mast 3 meters away from their house without having any recourse. These local protests were quickly relayed by parliamentarians who questioned the government 30 times in 1998 about the anarchical deployment of cell sites. These parliamentarians were contacted by a few whistleblowers against EMF, who were already denouncing power lines in the early 90s before turning their attention to mobile telephony. Only one of these whistleblowers was an academic. The others were coming from the field of building biology, which is a modernized equivalent of dosing. They resorted to unorthodox means to appear as credentialed experts, like using false academic titles. Their commitment was not disinterested, as they were selling EMF exposure measurements, shielding apparatus, books and courses on EMF and health. These whistleblowers provided parliamentarians with seemingly scientific arguments against mobile telephony, consisting mostly in lists of health issues attributed to cell phones and increasingly to cell sites. As a result, all questions these parliamentarians subsequently addressed to the government raised health concerns. The government took these concerns seriously, wanting to restore its legitimacy after a succession of health scandals in the late 80s, culminating in a former Prime Minister being judged for manslaughter in 1998. It created a dedicated agency for environmental health and safety in 2001, which was immediately tasked with a report on the safety of cell sites. The issue of cell sites was thus addressed exclusively as a health risk by the government, despite health concerns being notably absent from local protests. This amounted to a depoliticization, as the actual problems faced by residents were pushed aside. Experts could only address the safety of cell sites, not their aggressive modalities of deployment, nor the underlying economic policy of accelerated rollout. Mobile network operators supported this reframing, which was effectively covering their activities, and made no effort to accommodate the residents' view. As a result, the issue of cell sites remained unsettled, so that local protests kept multiplying and radicalizing. A national movement emerged in 2001 to federate same, whose officials met with whistleblowers against EMF and added health concerns to their arguments. Concurrently, the first expert report on cell site was published, concluding that EMF were likely safe, but also recommending directing their beams away from nurseries, schools and hospitals as a precautionary measure, in the hope of reassuring the public. Activists interpreted this contradiction as implicitly proving the harmfulness of cell sites, which experts could not openly acknowledge because of their conflicts of interest with mobile network operators. Together with the whistleblowers against EMF, they staged a scientific controversy, publishing their own counter-report in 2003. They managed to draw media attention, undermining the credibility of experts and making their conclusion inaudible. Instead, they successfully spread the notion that cell sites were harmful. For instance, in a survey conducted in 2005, nearly 55% of adults answered that cell sites were certainly or probably promoting cancer. From then on, the issue of cell sites kept developing, following the same pattern and eventually extending to other EMF-emitting devices. Cell sites kept proliferating as new communication protocols appeared. More than 85,000 are now operating in metropolitan France. They kept triggering local protests, as they were still problematic for the neighbors because of their anarchical deployment and visual impact. 3 new associations were created between 2004 and 2011 to federate these local protests and relay them at the national level, thus maintaining pressure on the government and health authorities. The government and health authorities kept answering by commissioning expert reports, bringing the number to 10 between 2001 and 2018. Experts kept concluding that cell sites were safe in their regulatory conditions of use, dispensing the government from further action, while occasionally recommending unwarranted precautionary measures. Activists were left with no choice but to challenge that conclusion. They had not contested the authorities' focalization on health risks carried by cell sites, which proved the only effective strategy to make them react. But as a result, activists could not acknowledge the safety of cell sites without giving up their fight. So they kept putting forward militant research like the BioEM2021 reports from 2007 and 2012. The public remained doubtful, as the provision of information of the safety of cell sites has a paradoxical effect of reinforcing worries. Lastly, the authorities could not dismiss the issue of cell sites, which still carries a significant reputational risk to them, as would say political scientists, and because they perceive the deployment of mobile telephony as essential to economic growth. As a consequence, the issue of cell sites has become impossible to resolve at the national level. The only solutions were found at the local level by the City Council of large cities, such as Paris in 2002 and Lyon in 2003, which signed charters with mobile network operators, compelling them to consult town planning authorities before any new installation and to address any objections from residents. This account clearly shows that EHS people were not involved in the process through which cell sites became contentious and were framed as a health risk. This process was mostly driven by people living nearby, activist groups trying to federate them, and a few self-proclaimed whistleblowers, none of whom were claiming to be EHS or even sick. Remarkably similar observations were made in the UK, the Netherlands, and the US. In each case, issues at first mostly related to environmental amenities and local democracy were addressed as health risks by central governments and their agencies, with the subsequent endorsement of activists thereby gaining political leverage, and without EHS people ever getting involved. On the contrary, in France, it was the controversy around cell sites that allowed EHS to spread and to establish itself as a specific social problem. Once the focalization on health risk was effective, in the early 2000s, activists and whistleblowers against cell sites encountered a difficulty: the absence of obvious victims whose damaged health would prove the harmfulness of these facilities. They began alluding to future victims likely to appear in tremendous numbers without a resolute intervention of the state. They accused cell sites of promoting many diseases, including cancer and Alzheimer's, but this threat felt somewhat empty. Thus, whistleblowers turned their attention to the neighbors of cell sites, among whom they inventoried many non-specific symptoms. This was likely the result of an attribution bias. Still, they attributed these symptoms first to the so-called microwave syndrome, then to EHS, which they read about in the scientific literature. Activists showed little interest for these conditions, being no less abstract than future victims. They kept highlighting the ill health of cell site neighbors without reducing it to a single disease. But in 2005, they began to be contacted by people feeling sick because of various electronic or electrical devices, not limited to mobile telephony. Those attributions were not new. I have heard about examples dating back to the mid-90s. But people feeling sick because of EMF likely remain isolated, being very few and having no way of connecting to each other at a time when the internet was not widespread in France. Activists against cell sites, once they succeeded in attracting media coverage, become a rallying point for such people. They promoted the EHS attribution process as it was contributing to the appearance of victims. They presented EHS as an additional proof of the harmfulness of EMF and strived to make it known, especially by publishing testimonies online and referring journalists to EHS people for interviews. Thus, they made it easier for other individuals with medically unexplained symptoms to suspect EMF. One activist group against cell sites also set up an EHS hotline, which acted as a gateway into EHS for many people I interviewed. While EHS people were growing in number, they were facing more pressing issues than the regulation of cell sites related to coping with a disabling environmental condition. They founded their own support group from 2008 onwards, where the discussions converged around the feeling of being victims, both of wireless technologies and of complacent authorities. As a result, they politicized their action with core demands concerning the entitlement of EHS people to healthcare and social benefits, an increased public awareness of their condition, and a significant reduction of legal EMF exposure limits. For instance, in the early 2010s, illegally occupied several EMF dead zones, asking them to be converted into permanent refuges for EHS people. EHS activists were supported by leading figures of the French environmental health movement, most notably Dominique Belpomme, a former oncologist who opened a practice of environmental medicine in 2009 and received nearly 2,000 hypersensitive patients in the following decade. Their efforts had mixed results. EHS activists succeeded in drawing media attention to the situation, receiving episodic but mostly positive coverage in local and national media. As EHS grew more familiar to the public, it became easier for EHS people to talk about it and even to diagnose themselves as such, the necessary information being more readily available. However, the number of EHS people remains in the low thousands, which is rather negligible in a country with 66 million inhabitants. Additionally, the medical and legal recognition of EHS has not substantially progressed, as the lobbying of officials and parliamentarians solely translated into calls for further research. As a result, those wishing to be recognized as EHS are left to seek legal recourse, but only a handful of court proceedings have proven successful so far. This account is consistent with the hypothesis that EHS is not primarily a belief generating symptoms among people worried about EMF, as proposed by several EHS researchers. EHS rather appears as a coping strategy for people with pre-existing medically unexplained symptoms, which they strive to control and explain through their attribution to EMF. In that regard, EHS is very similar to other purported diseases like fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue syndrome. What sets EHS apart is that it was never significantly endorsed by health professionals, probably because EHS people's claims are too extraordinary to believe. They blame devices, such as cell phones, that have become so anodyne and unremarkable in everyday life that exceptionally strong evidence would be required for people to admit their harmfulness. In the absence of such incontrovertible proof, physicians tend to dismiss EHS as psychosomatic illness that it would be professional incompetence to mistake for a real disease. As a result, EHS remains exclusively self-diagnosed, which is obviously much more difficult than receiving an EHS diagnostic from a health professional, and probably explains the very low number of EHS people. For the same reason, EHS activists fail to secure allies in the struggle for the recognition of their condition, making it likely that without the controversy around cell sites, EHS would never have gained sufficient momentum to impose itself as a social problem and receive attention from the authorities. What also sets EHS apart are its adverse consequences for the people identifying as such. Their efforts to reduce their exposure to EMF prove costly and rather ineffective in alleviating their symptoms, so that they often end up in objectively worse situations. For instance, still feeling sick after having spent all their savings on EMF shielding apparatus, lost their jobs, quarreled with their families, and so on. A really important question to address is this: how can we help self-diagnose EHS people to find better ways of coping with their symptoms? This might require a firmer stance from health authorities and the scientific community regarding EHS, to help people identifying as EHS or wondering if they are EHS to move away from these attributions. Given what is already known about EHS and EMF health effects, the possibility that EHS does result from EMF exposure seems very low at best. I believe it does no good to shy away from acknowledging it, because it leaves people with medically unexplained symptoms vulnerable to attributions that are ultimately self-defeating. So the question I would like to discuss in that workshop is the following. What will it take to acknowledge that EHS is not an electromagnetic condition, instead of continuously calling for further research? Thank you.